Today I'm sitting down with Logan, aka Runesmith. He is a D&D content creator on YouTube that made the Basically D&D series, as well as the Tall Tales Live Play YouTube channel. Recently, he has started creating his own content for the game through his work on Kickstarter Stibble's Codex of Companions and The Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns. We talk about that, his creative process for these books, what it's like working with a team, and what it's like to create content for Dungeons & Dragons. And then we talk about his creative process when it comes to DMing/playing his own characters, how he writes them, how he comes up with his ideas, and how he incorporates them into a hidden story within his books. Without further ado, sit back and relax. You're listening to Roll for Insight. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Roll for Insight. Runesmith, aka Logan, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad I could make it after a day of flying.
Thank you so much for getting back and get back to me on that, because I understand that conventions can really burn you out.
Oh yeah.
But I'm glad. Did you have a good time at PAX?
Yeah, it was really fun seeing all the people that I saw 2 years ago, and everyone. The entire time we kept referring to the last convention as last year, and we're just gonna pretend that that's what happened. But It was nice to see everyone. Nice to see all the companies that I've been able to support actually getting booths there. It was a good time.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's one of the best things about doing this content creation thing, is that you see the people that you've worked with and you helped. Yeah, but anyway, we have a tradition on Roll for Insight. A question we ask every episode, super important. Runesmith, what is your D&D pet peeve? It's not something that's going to break up a friendship or a group, but it is something that makes you go, ugh, why'd you do that?
I'd say, okay, narratively, fights always ending in everyone, like all the enemies dying. I feel like that's super unrealistic, and like looking back on all the times that we've just, gone through an entire dungeon, killed everyone, and no one ran away, it's like, we're not the good guys right now. We can't keep pretending that we are, but that's kind of always how it goes, so that's the first one off the dome.
It's just like you can't. So do you often have, when you're DMing, how do you gauge when an enemy decides, I'm out, I'm not doing this anymore? Because obviously you want fights to be hard, but you also...
It really depends on the enemy. I'd say a lot of the smaller ones are more the average ones. It would be at about half hit points when they're bloodied, is when they're like, oh, this fight isn't quite going the way I want it to. And then you look at the character's actual determination. It's like, do they want to die on this hill? Are they going to push themselves to see if they can get lucky? Or are they going to run away early?
Yeah, because like a bandit is going to preserve its life a lot more than like a zombie who's being controlled by something else.
Yeah. It's also pretty funny if you think about how turns happen over 6 seconds. So if a bandit is killed in one turn, he attacks once and then everyone swings all at once and he's dead. And that's a really tragic way to go.
Yeah, and that's also traumatizing for everyone else that's watching that.
Mm-hmm.
But often you see so often that like DMs will have their enemies fight to death, when really, like, why would they? Because most creatures don't want to die.
Very few.
Very few, yeah. So... I mean, other than that, when you are running your games, and we've talked about so often on the show, because they've announced recently that they're working on like whatever the next evolution or edition of Dungeons & Dragons will be. Whether it's 5.5, whether it's 6th edition, probably 5.5. Whatever comes next, a lot of people we brought on the show have talked about what they are hoping for when it comes to the next edition, like what they would want to fix with their critiques, or just not fix is an aggressive term, like change, And, we've talked about a flaw with monsters, with a lot of monsters not having any sort of inbuilt, like, when do they run away kind of thing. It leaves it up to the Dungeon Master to do all the thinking for them. So what would you want to change if you were to jump into 5.5 or whatever comes next?
I think they could stand to overhaul just the whole concept of the challenge rating system, because the diversity of player characters and the diversity of monster abilities, they don't fit into any mold or grain that's very effective. So instead of recreating or reestablishing it, I think they could just stand to explain or maybe remove some part of it.
Yeah. And also, I mean, on top of like diversity of player characters, I mean, there's so many different monsters with save or suck spell effects.
Yeah.
And like, it doesn't matter how big dick of a barbarian you are. If you roll bad on that Basilisk Paralyze, you're paralyzed and there's nothing you can do about it.
Very rock, paper, scissors, not hard or easy.
Yeah, and there's plenty of CR10 monsters that can get wiped out in one round by a well-coordinated party, and plenty of CR5 hordes that can wipe out a party if they're just not rolling well that day.
Absolutely.
So yeah. I don't know how, the one thing, like, whenever I critique challenge rating, though, I always get worried, like, I don't know how I would overhaul it. Like, would I put, like, a list of things, like, consider this, consider this, consider that? Because I have no idea how they calculate challenge rating.
It's based on damage per round and survivability. There's a lot of very finite and specific mechanics for it. But I think, I know they would have to retrace their steps over every monster, so it's not doable within, like, it's not a reasonable request. But I think if they were to divide it into, like, spellcasters, beefcake, fighters, and then, like, more agile or dexterous monsters, and then have different challenge types in addition to challenge ratings.
I mean, you have worked with a lot. I mean, when you're creating your Kickstarter projects, like, you have Stibbles, you have Seeker's Guide to Twisted Taverns, both of which were massive successes on Kickstarter, by the way. Congratulations, I have to say.
Thank you.
Awesome on that.
I hope the third one does well.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it will, because you have been on a roll with these books. But when you are working, when you do work with a team, like, how does the creative process of creating this book work for you?
What we've currently kind of gotten into is I start with, a concept, obviously, and then from that, I build what's called a project Bible. So I look at all the other books, I make a template from that, like, okay, what's the flow of information here? What's the flow of the adventure, the content? And then from there, we try and hire 2 or 3 writers, and I'm probably going to bump it up to 4 to 5 with the next one because the time crunch is tough. But then I divide the writing among them and myself, and then while they're writing, sometimes faster than me, I have to go and review all their writing, make sure it fits the bill, and do kind of a second wave of edits. So it's nice to work with a few people that get the idea, but not everyone knows balancing as well as the other people. Not everyone knows narrative descriptions or flavor text. So everyone has their strengths, and a big part of kind of writing and directing this book or these books is just a matter of putting people in their strong suits.
So when you are working with these teams, I mean, how do you factor in the problems that you've seen with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? Like, have you changed anything up? Have you told them, hey, I want to kind of shift focus here because you've seen that as a flaw in a D&D module or a source book? Or do you just try to go your own way, not really worrying about, like, looking at what's established?
Yeah, that kind of is a sort of solution to those problems, is instead of revisiting these things that kind of don't work or that I don't like the way that they work, like especially alignment is just something that is not very functional anymore. So instead of exploring them and going in depth with the books, what I do is I add new systems and new types of mechanics. And it hopefully is letting people know that, you can kind of use whichever pool of mechanics you want and discard the others.
Yeah.
Like for Stibbles, we had the companion mechanic. For the Seeker's Guide, we had a whole random dungeon mechanic. And then for the next one, we have crafting and resources as opposed to a sort of economy. So that'll be interesting.
So yeah, that totally makes sense. Like, when you are, like, writing your own work, you need to factor in, like, what you've already seen. Is there something that you have, like, made sure to include in the 2 books you've already written? Like, when you started out, you were like, yes, this needs to be here. Like, a choice that you've made that you were like, from the get-go, like, we need to make this happen. Whether it was a focus on some aspect of the game or focusing on multiple aspects of the game. Like, what did you want included from the get-go?
Well, the first one, it was just kind of an idea that I had had for a very long time. And I pulled some traits from that, and then I started working on the Eldermancy universe. So there is an underlying tone in each one of the books that I've made so far and the ones that I plan to make that has kind of this meta angle to it, where the book is kind of, the book and the content is a little bit more than what it seems. And there is a general kind of silent function that each of the books are serving that I'm making sure is hinted at in as many pages as I can. An overarching story through all the content, pretty much.
So beyond just, like, the single book, like, you have an overarching story over, like, the 3 that you're writing?
Yes.
So when you were, how did you, I mean, that is a big commitment. Like even creating like a D&D campaign overarching over the entire session, like a DM needs to put in a lot of work and to make it all flow naturally. I mean, God forbid you create 3 books. That's a lot that you have to plan out. So when you were in the planning phases of doing that, like what were you thinking and how did you manage all of this story content over 3 separate books?
I think it was important at the start to have a loose idea of what I wanted and made sure that that was concrete, and then have what the idea was be relatively adaptable. So it's a secret that is learned by essentially conquering the Seeker's Guide, so I can't give it away. Once the rest, like the next books are going to be a bit more apparent or transparent in how that function works. So kind of just starting with the experiment, going with the flow, and then writing down everything that I have established to make sure that I don't forget it or kind of trip over it. And just moving forward from there, keeping all those notes and that information close to my chest.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, you've created 2 of these at this point, run 2 successful Kickstarters, and obviously, like, homebrewed, kickstarted projects, they've been around for a hot minute now, but recently I've seen them pop up a lot more, and I've seen a lot of them come up on DriveThruRPG, on Kickstarter, on Patreon. A lot of people are creating homebrew content, not just books, source books, but also just other stuff too. And all of it is really cool, but some of it doesn't work out as well. I mean, that's just the truth of when you're working in a creative industry. Sometimes it doesn't work. When I mean, you've run 2 of these at this point very successfully. What is your advice for people who want to dive into trying to create their own RPG business and backing themselves on Kickstarter, Patreon, or what have you?
My advice is that success has nothing to do with the finances. It's a matter of if you set out to do something, if you set out to create something, no matter the quality, you want to get it done. You don't want to get money by getting it done. I think you immediately set yourself up for failure if you plan on just making bank. And like the first book was well funded. We had a lot of resources. We were able to do a lot of effective marketing. There were obviously, as most people say, I had very knowledgeable people working with me doing things that I couldn't do. So obviously, of course, know what you're doing. Don't expect to succeed every time. And surround yourself with people that you like to work with.
I mean, you talked about hiccups. I mean, even the most successful project has like their bad juju moments. Was there any hiccup that you encountered while writing either Skibbles or Twisted? I mean, you're still in the middle of Twisted Taverns, but is there any hiccup that you
Twisted
encountered?
Taverns is actually fully packaged.
Oh, dang!
Shipping out in a couple months. It'll be cool.
That's exciting. I really want that mug. Was I too late?
Oh no, it should be on the shop. It turns out that mug is actually bigger than the official D&D one. That's a very similar style. So I'm proud.
I've got a collection of unnecessarily elaborate mugs,
nice.
And so I was hoping to add it to my collection. I will pick it up after this interview is concluded.
Yeah. So for Stibbles, there was something that happened because our campaign ended in March, the year 2020. So. Yeah, COVID kind of happened right when the Kickstarter ended. And I think the major hiccup that hit that book was shipping, because shipping immediately got massively delayed alongside everything else that was happening. We had to pay like twice as much. And, you know, obviously you can't beat yourself up over them, but there are going to be typos no matter how many times you review a book. And there were a lot of little oversights that are all like learning points as you go. You know, failure is a part of succeeding. They go hand in hand. Like, I don't think that the experience point values are in Stibbles. It's just the challenge rating numbers. I didn't know that the hit die was tied to a monster's size. So there's some tiny guys with like a D10, which is a huge monster's hit die. And then with Seeker's Guide, I really think that with Seeker's Guide and the book that I just finished writing the manuscript for, it's just the timeline can be very tight. It's very, very hard to pace yourself effectively.
Yeah, pacing is a huge part of the creative process. Like, people either get into like a writer's block where they're not going anywhere, or they're working too fast and they end up making sloppy mistakes. I mean, when you are trying to pace yourself for your own work, I mean, what's your process to making sure that you stay on track but don't like lose yourself in it?
Oh, panic and lose myself in it. That's how I do it.
I find that perfectly respectable.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to it yet. I'm going to be taking a break after this book just to reassess kind of how I've handled the process, you know, see the points that I struggle and try and fix them, and then come back at it a lot more confidently.
Yeah. But I mean, other than panicking when you're working with your own books, what else would you see as like what else would you say is like a step that you need to take in order to improve your work further? I mean, you got a third book in the works. Like, what are you trying to do to improve an already pretty successful process?
Yeah, so it's difficult when you have kind of a loose idea going into it, and then like you have all these ideas as you're writing. So, oh, I want to add this if we have time. I want to add that. So I think a big part of just even starting the process is knowing that you have to finish at some point. You have to release it from your hands and be like, okay, at this point, when I'm done writing this section that I've set aside for this week, I won't touch it anymore. Or I'll step away for a while and then I'll come back. And that is very hard to do.
I mean, you talked about like it being very hard to set down certain aspects of your story or your work. When you were working on either book, I mean, what was the parts that you were just the most into, like the most passionate about? What was the thing that made you go, yeah, this is really good? You didn't want to set it down. This isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, so definitely for Seeker's Guide, it was putting that kind of National Treasure style secret hunt and lacing it throughout all the pages, making sure all the production was done right, making sure everything fit the vision. So having that finally done and laced all over the book was super exciting. I also thought it was really cool to get the actual dungeon tiles for the board game style dungeon that we have. Yeah, I think just kind of seeing each of the taverns come to life and get the art falling into place for them was really incredible.
But Dungeons and Dragons, when you mentioned in one of your videos that you haven't your latest one that you hadn't gotten into the game as extensively after you got into the author business.
Yeah, the writing process, you could say.
Yeah, the writing process. Yeah, but I mean, how have you kind of like resolved, I don't know how to describe it, resolve the cognitive dissonance of like you're writing for this game, but I mean, writing for the game has caused you to not play it as much.
Yeah, it's really funny. I think there definitely needs to be a balance, like for people who write a lot and they get writer's block, you're supposed to read. For people who, perform a lot and then kind of lose that performance, you need to watch more performances. It just kind of happens naturally. I haven't really conquered it yet, but I would like to get back into the game and kind of get a refresher for just how it feels to play D&D and kind of the genuine struggles that you face in the moment, as opposed to just this abstract network of all these concepts and mechanics and storylines. They're two very different worlds.
Yeah, exactly. Like the theory of running a game, like when you're thinking about it in your head, is so different from when you actually sit down and are running the game with thinking people who make their own choices.
It's like art appreciation versus making art. Completely different.
Yeah, like I don't even know the first thing about either of those subjects. Or listening to music versus like music theory. Like when you're listening to jazz, like oh yeah, that solo sounds cool. But like when you look at what they're doing and the complexity of every chord change, and it's a way different experience.
Yeah, different languages.
But I mean, you mentioned that you think it's very important for like artists to look at art or reader or writers to read. What is a really important lesson that you took from games that you played? I mean, Stibble was a character that you played in a D&D game. Like, how do the games that you played influence the way you wrote your work?
I think it kind of helps to know the personality that you're going for, and to be able to role play in different personalities gives you a lot more confidence with, oh, this is more how this character would act, as opposed to writing yourself in every character. Then it kind of becomes bland. So to be able to fall into these different roles really helps just kind of expand your perception of what characters can do and kind of who they are.
I mean, I ask this almost not every episode, but almost every episode I ask this because everyone gives a different answer. I mean, you've created, you have the Seeker, you got Stibble, you've created these really cool characters, and beyond them, player characters we haven't seen or NPCs we haven't seen. I mean, when you're creating a character for Dungeons and Dragons, like what is your creative process? What's your thinking when you are creating either a player character or NPC? Are they different? Are they similar?
That really is an interesting question. I think that I don't know. They're all kind of come from slightly different thoughts where it's just, you're going about your business one day and then you have a thought that springs kind of from what you're looking at or what you're doing or what you're reading. And you're like, oh, that's not going to go away. I want to develop that into like a basic character and then just start playing them. So I don't really create the characters entirely. Like I have a rough idea and I know the kind of mindset that I want them to have. And then they really only develop while I'm playing.
I mean, would you say that you're quick to develop characters, or does it take a little bit more time? Like recently, one of the just last night actually, which is why I stayed up until like 2 a.m. one of our player characters perished, and we had to create a new one. And she had an idea like right out the gate, like 1 hour later, for a class she had never even heard of, and for a race that she didn't even know existed. Like I was like, how did you do that? Like that's not. Like, I take a while to create characters. So for you, is it quick or is it slow burn?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty quick. I try not to overthink the creation process because I know if I set like expectations for this character, like, oh, I can picture them like flying through the air with an axe hitting a dragon. It's like, that's not what's going to happen in game. So I don't like make all these scenarios. I don't really make playlists for the characters. I like to just kind of sit down, forget who I am, and just live as this character for a little while, whoever they happen to become as I play.
Yeah, so you're like a more make it in the game kind of guy.
Yeah. I mean, it's fun to kind of throw together a background, and I have done a bunch of that. I have a huge just folder with documents and documents of like little short stories of characters before they show up in the game, but that doesn't really affect the game, so like writing characters like the Seeker or a lot of other NPCs in the book, it's a very different process where I build them based on kind of a D&D 5e written template. But when you're playing someone, it's absolutely different.
How much emphasis, like if you were to DM, or even if you are a player character, because I mean, it's not like player characters don't have any influence on the way the game is run. They do.
Yeah.
Of course they do. They're playing this game. But you mentioned that you often don't see that those backstories affect the game. How much priority do you put on having those backstories integrated into the campaign? A lot of DMs will say like it's like a definite I need to do that, and a lot of DMs just realize that they don't have the sort of time to make it happen. Some players want it, some players don't.
Yeah, I really think it depends on the player, the players that you have, and the setting that you have, of course. Because if you have a setting that's kind of out there, then the players, you kind of need to make sure ahead of time that they know that, your backstory isn't going to be as exact as you want it, because this setting isn't as generic as you think it is. So kind of having just that full communication with the players while they're doing the character building process. And then, like you said, asking them, hey, do you want me to involve this? Because I can throw in some characters and you won't know when they come in. And it's always super fun to have the background or the backstory that you create involved. But if you don't have a backstory, you can kind of pull it out of your butt as you go. Like make up like, oh, I used to know that person. And they're like, what? And then you play it off of the DM. Of course, you have to have a good DM for that, but...
Yeah, that's probably my favorite thing about these, like when a player actually, I love that as a DM. I love that when a player will spontaneously go, actually, you know what? I think my character could weave, or my character was enthusiastic about clothes, something like that, because I think that's really cool. Mm-hmm. Like people can be surprising. So I should
always encourage that. Never D&D it's an improv storytelling game that also functions identically as a war combat game. So yes, and should be very important, I think.
I mean, I do have to ask, how often do you DM as opposed to play? Like some people will 100% one and not the other, so I should ask.
I'd say about 50-50. The most that we play is in Tall Tales, and that game, it's just like, hey, does anyone want a DM? I got to run the tech, so I don't want to, but I can throw myself into it pretty easily. It's obviously very difficult to have confidence when DMing online, but I think in terms of enjoyment, I definitely like playing the character more in smaller parties.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that you play. I mean, a lot of people have seen you play and streaming games, and I talked to Davy about this, and I talked to Duke from D&D Shorts about this. But streaming and playing D&D online, it's a whole different ball game than playing in person. Like, what's been your experience with playing D&D in front of an audience?
It definitely can be a different ball game. It really depends on your mindset. I know people like Critical Role. Obviously, once they're off stage, it's very different. But when they're playing, it really is just a group of friends going at their own pace. And Arcane Arcade, the way Jacob likes to play his game, is just a group of friends going at their own pace. I feel a little more pressure to kind of put on, a general performance. So I don't like as many pauses in my game. So I try and kind of double up my energy and be like, okay, let's make sure something's happening so nobody gets bored.
Yeah, Red Bull. So when you're running, you think that it is completely different from when you're just running like with just your friends in a living room.
I think so, yeah.
I mean, when you're playing, do you also feel that pressure, or is it solely when you are the DM who's trying to get the game going? Because when you're a player, it's not as much your responsibility.
Yeah, well, I feel the responsibility if the game starts to lag as a player. Like if everyone's standing around not knowing what to do, I get a little irritated. I'm like, okay, we've been talking about this for a really long time and no one agrees. I'm going to instigate. So I like to sometimes play a bit more instigative characters when we're on stream, but I kind of feel that way anyway. Just, I like to play the game as a character.
So, I mean, you mentioned the reason I asked the DM player question because I wanted to know when you are a player, how often do those spontaneous moments, we were talking about spontaneity and creating character like during the game, like create character, was there a notable aspect of Stibble or the Seeker's personality that came to you while playing them, or any player character doesn't really matter if they're...
Yeah, I actually haven't played the Seeker. I feel like they're a very individual character that are kind of ambiguous. I wouldn't fit who they're supposed to be very well. I wouldn't be able to roleplay that. But Stibbles was intentionally extremely spontaneous. His entire, the way he looks is actually a visual gag based on the Travelocity gnome. And so I just gave him this massively tragic backstory that turns him into a vagabond. And he's just a crazy little guy that's willing to do anything as long as it's something. It fits really well into certain characters, kind of moments of spontaneity.
Yeah. I mean, do you have a favorite character that you haven't shown us? I mean, a lot of people like the Seeker and like Stibble. I mean, I was so happy to see so much art of the Seeker because, I mean, they are a very unique and cool character and some cool representation in the RPG community that we don't get that often. And see all that art was really neat.
It was while I was kind of learning about that field of people, and obviously because it's new, it's difficult for people to be able to understand, or it's new to the public the way that it's been presented. So it's kind of eye-opening to be able to explore that people can feel that way, and then to be able to represent that I'm very proud.
Yeah, very wholesome. I liked it a lot. But I mean, is there a character that you haven't shown to the public that you're really proud of? And if so, like, who are they? And like, how did you come about creating them? And would you ever show the public this character?
Yeah, so I actually think that the villain that I made for the next book, which is our first adventure supplement, there are like 5 villains, and they're all working against each other at the same time that the party is playing. But this one guy, it's not often that you see dwarves as like the primary antagonist. So he is a quote-unquote undead dwarf who has filled his body completely with really hyper-condensed blood that he's collected from countless sacrifices across his lifetime. So when you approach him, it's this massive area where blood rain is just falling down. And then the moment that he is revived, it all just gets absorbed by him. And you're like, oh, he's going to kill us.
That's awesome.
But his history is just this hyper-manipulative king who... brought all these people to this location under a false pretense and then quietly started working to destroy everything for selfish reasons. And eventually he got defeated, and hopefully the party can defeat him again.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. By the way, what you pointed out, dwarves are never the bad guys. You were totally right about that.
Yeah.
Like, do you have any guess as to why that is?
Well, I think, I don't want to be derogatory, but I think that size does naturally equate to terror. That's why the Tarrasque is the #1 monster. It's this huge thing. But, massive things can come in small packages. And this dude is a very massive threat to the entire campaign. It'll be fun for the party to fight him. And I kind of played into it a little bit. He does have the ability to expand that blood and grow to the size of like a fire giant.
Yeah, that is interesting, though. You're totally right. Like, often we associate, because, I mean, when you go to the final big boss, it's not very often, especially like when you look at video games, that they're human-sized.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's why I
And
like.
when they are, it's kind of more terrifying
Yeah.
in a sense. So hopefully we'll be able to capture that as the GMs run the game.
Yeah, that's why I was so happy. I mean, have you played the PS4 exclusive? It's Ghost of Tsushima.
Yeah, no, I haven't. But most of the enemies are human sized, right?
Yeah, they are. That's why I was so. But the final, I mean, the final boss is the Khan. He's a big dude with big armor. But the actual final boss is just a dude, and you and the dude are just wearing normal like robes, and it's just a duel with just swords, no armor, underneath a tree, and it's like the most gorgeous, most incredible fight ever, and it's way more down to earth than what you normally see.
I think that's really cool.
Yeah, so yeah, you're totally right. Like a human-sized, normal, or like even a shorter villain is actually sometimes more intimidating. But yeah, when you are working through your creative process, we're probably going to wrap up here. When you're working through your creative process and DMs are trying to create something unique and interesting to challenge their players, or players trying to create a unique character to integrate into the campaign. And what's your tip? I mean, you've created a lot of really cool, unique creations for Dungeons and Dragons so far, and you're going to create some more. This dwarf sounds awesome. Yeah. What is your tip for people who want to sort of do that in their own games?
Just look in as many diverse places as you can for inspiration. Just like keep your mind open at all times, and if you have a question, ask it always. Like my Wikipedia history is so insanely massive. I look into so many different things like chemistry, biology, obviously a lot of nature, and the elements presented or represented in nature are really inspiring, and you can easily kind of adapt them if you're clever enough, if you think about it enough, into a human story or into characters or into a setting. Just translate things by grabbing two things that you've never thought about being related before and slam them together. Like for this next book, the two main themes are going to be kind of Polynesian, Hawaiian, and Norse, which haven't really been combined before. So I'm hoping that that'll be interesting.
Yeah, but that sounds awesome. I'm a big fan of both cultures. So yes, thank you so much. All that is left. Thank you so much for coming onto the show, by the way. I've got to say that one more time.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, Thank you for having me.
Of course. Big fan. But all that's left to do at the end of the episode, Runesmith. Logan, what have you got going on this week?
Oh, nothing. I might play Final Fantasy with Joe Cat for the first time.
That sounds awesome. That's not nothing.
Well, yeah. I mean, compared to the fact that I just finished the manuscript, so I've just been doing nothing but work and then PAX, and now I'm finally back home. I haven't been able to veg out in like a month. So it's a very special kind of nothing.
Honestly, nothing sounds really good right about now. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Roll for Insight and you want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of our content, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern, as well as subscribe to Runesmith if you haven't already. Subscribe to Tall Tales too. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment, basically D&D, to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. We'll both see you all next time. Farewell.